the Uluru Statement from the Heart is the document that expresses this desire for an Indigenous voice to be recognised in the Constitution and established by the Constitution. But it's a more complex document than that. It is a document prepared by a large group of people representing Indigenous peoples of Australia, and it expresses a desire to have recognised not just a voice, but the Indigenous nations themselves and their traditional connection with the land of Australia, and even speaks in the language of sovereignty, the sovereignty of those Indigenous peoples over these lands, and speaks of the calls for a coming together of Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians, and a process whereby a treaty or treaties would be negotiated between Indigenous nations and the Australian governments.
So is it one treaty or is it 600 treaties or somewhere in between?
It's a very good question, because there are, as you say, so many different Indigenous communities, each of them in one sense a separate nation, and so many different governments in Australia as well. So it's an open question around exactly how many treaties that idea would lead to. And so in the Uluru Statement, the Indigenous voice is seen as the first step towards establishing those treaties as well. So if the proposal were to be carried at a referendum, and we don't know the answer to that, it might not be. If it was, and if legislation was enacted to establish the voice, one would expect that there would be many Indigenous people that would be pressing that the first item on the agenda would be a treaty.
The Prime Minister has said he commits in full.
Yeah.
So we need to be absolutely clear the Prime Minister's intent is that we should move to a treaty, or treaties plural, and it's another area where, with respect, I just have to say, we do not know what the proposal might look like. We don't know whether it would lead to endless disagreements between Aboriginal people, because I've seen so much of that.
Yeah.
I've seen so much of it. And it's a tragedy because it holds them back. It doesn't advance anybody.
That's right.
We don't know whether it would lead to calls for reparations, because it has in other parts of the world. And one aspect of it is that they've never ceded, the Uluru Statement from the Heart says, sovereignty, meaning it was never recognised because it wasn't. I think that's fair to say. And they feel they've never ceded it. But what in their mind do they mean by sovereignty?
Yeah. It's not fully defined in the Uluru Statement. There are words to this effect that it's a spiritual notion.
And what does that mean?
I think it's a reflection or an allusion to Indigenous understandings of the relationship between those Indigenous nations and the land itself, which I'm really not competent to explain or even understand at any length myself. And it's interesting, the use of the word sovereignty, because in Western and European and even international context, the word sovereignty is a term that's used to designate the authority of a nation state. And those nation states are the only entities at international law that can enter into treaties. So there's a very close relationship at international law between sovereignty and treaty. However, when one speaks of, say, Indigenous sovereignty as a concept or an Indigenous treaty as a concept, the question is, are you talking about treaty and sovereignty in the same sense? Or are you talking about it in what might be called a more domestic sense? And what is the relationship then between that sovereignty and that treaty to the Constitution itself? And I suspect that that's what drives some debate within Indigenous people, among Indigenous peoples, about whether the voice should come first and then a treaty, or whether a treaty should come first and then the voice. Because if you put the voice into the Constitution, it is a recognition that it has to be put into the Constitution. It's not the other way around, that the treaty is the framework within which the Constitution's understood, and then the voice is understood. It's rather that the Constitution is the context in which the voice is understood. And I suspect that that is one of the driving reasons for that debate amongst Indigenous people about whether to support the voice or not, and whether a treaty should be the pathway or whether the voice should be the pathway.
See, my great fear is that the idea of a treaty would be driven by elites purporting to represent Aboriginal people, whereas in reality, they are. This is not to denigrate Aboriginal people and their communities at all. They were very diverse. And in some ways, to not respect that diverse, A, will lead to strife, but B, could be very disrespectful to a lot of smaller communities. So in a practical sense, I'm deeply worried by that problem. And it seems to me too that depending on the nature of the treaty, what you'd be doing, what many people would be doing would be signing something that said we're an autonomous people at the same time as, in fact, to be utterly realistic about it now, we can't live as islands in this country, Australia. We are Australians together. So a needy Aboriginal community that is heavily dependent upon the support of the broader Australian taxpayer, how does it work for them to have an independent treaty and establish their own national sovereignty? Does it indicate a desire to withdraw altogether and have their own lifestyle and substitute for the normal systems of governments and commerce that we have? These things are not being explained or explored in any way that's meaningful to the Australian people.